Good evening. I think we'll go ahead and get our lecture started. It looks like everyone who could possibly make it has made it. Can we have some volume up, or can you hear me? Are you able to hear me in the back? Yes. Can you hear me in the front? That's the real question. Yes, good. Well, I'll try to speak up. Good evening and welcome to this Idea Fest lecture. My name is Howard Brunt. I'm the Vice President of Research at the University of Victoria, and it's my great honor and pleasure to be able to MC tonight's talk and question and answer period. On behalf of the university community, I want to begin by acknowledging with respect the history, customs, and culture of the Coast Salish and Strait Salish people on whose traditional lands we meet today. Tonight's lecture is being presented as part of UVic's week-long Idea Fest. It's the first time we've done this. It's a series of about 30 different lectures, talks, presentations, performances across campus. And we are looking forward to having you participate in those. This year was a bit of a trial for us to try this for the first time. And next year, as part of the university's 50th anniversary, this will be a much larger event. But from all signs, this has been a great success already, and we're only 2 days into it. In this case, this is a collaboration between the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions and the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. Idea Fest is a unique opportunity for the entire community, both within the university and beyond, to celebrate UVic's diversity and strength in research, scholarly, and creative activities. It's a week-long event which started, as I said, yesterday, and there are more than 30 events happening across campus. I'd invite you to visit the UVic website, and you can find a link off of that to Idea Fest, and you can see all the various things that are going on this week. This evening's lecture is really the second. Last night we had a lecture that looked at climate and the oceans. So a bit of a theme here. Tonight we're looking at climate and in terms of food security. This evening's lecture is about climate change and how it relates to the future of food security, particularly in our province. UVic is a national leader in climate change research with expertise in its scientific, social, and economic aspects. We lead and host the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, a multi-university initiative that conducts and promotes research on climate change science, impacts, and mitigation strategies. Working with PICS and really its sister organization is the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. It's a regional climate research service center at UVic which provides information on the physical impacts of climate variability and change for industry, government, and other community organizations. Food security is widely discussed at the local, national, and international level, and UVic as well is a leader in this area. And we have a project funded by the Vancouver Island Community Research Alliance called the Vancouver Island Local Food Project. This project is bringing research, resources, and action together across the island together to strengthen key areas of the food system in which we reside. Tonight, we are really fortunate to have two of UVic's most prolific researchers giving us their thoughts on this important topic and really bringing climate and food security together. So I'll tell you just a little bit more about them. Dr. Francis Zwiers, Francis, right there, is the director of the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium and an adjunct professor in both UVic's Department of Mathematics and Statistics and in the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science at Simon Fraser University. Before coming to UVic in 2010, Francis worked for the Environment Canada, most recently as the director of the Climate Research Division. His expertise is in the application of statistical methods to the analysis of observed and simulated climate variability and change. Francis is a lead author of the Interagency Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which many of you will know about, and he's a highly respected climate researcher internationally. We're very fortunate to have him here at the University of Victoria. Dr. Aleck Ostry holds a prestigious Canada Research Chair in the Social Determinants of Community Health, and he's a professor in the Department of Geography here at the University of Victoria. He's also a senior scholar with the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research in British Columbia. He conducts an extensive program on the social determinants of health with a focus on rural health, food, security, and nutrition policy. Aleck recently co-authored a white paper on the topic of climate change and food security in BC with a special focus on the future of food as it relates to Vancouver Island. He is also busy leading the Vancouver Island Food Project, which I just told you about. Tonight's presentation will no doubt help us all to better understand how climate change will impact food production and security both in general and more specifically here in BC and on the island. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Zwiers and Dr. Ostry, who are here to share their thoughts and research on the future of food in our province. There will be plenty of time for questions. We hope to wrap up the presentations in about 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and then we'll go into questions, and we hope to, we'll actually try to wrap up by about 9 p.m. For those of you obviously, if you need to leave earlier, that's fine, but we hope you can get your questions in. I know this affects and interests each and every one of us here tonight. So without further ado, I turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Francis Zwiers.
Thank you, Howard. We're going to turn down the lights so that you can see the slides in a little bit more detail. And in particular, so that you can see this slide. Some of you might recognize where this photo was taken. It's taken from atop a very well-known Victoria landmark at the top of Mount Doug. It's a February morning, and you're looking essentially to the south. And the reason for showing you this photo is that it allows me to introduce the climate system to you. So just about everything that we think about in the climate system, both on a local scale and on a global scale, is present in this photo. And so first thing that you're aware of is that there's some land surface in the foreground. There's water in the background. That's Puget Sound and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. There's an atmosphere. There's a sun that provides the climate system with energy. That's an external influence on the climate system because the amount of energy that flows from the sun isn't quite constant over time. And so there are periods with more solar output and periods with less solar output, and that has some influence on the climate system. There are clouds that are present, and that's one of the things that we have a tough time representing in climate models. That continues to be a large uncertainty. And in particular, you see that there's a sundog here. It's located at 22.5 degrees off the sun. That indicates the presence of ice crystals in the high atmosphere, and that thin ice cloud is really tough to model. Now, there's other stuff that's present here as well. So you notice that there's a contrail here. Comes from an aircraft. There are lots of aircraft that fly in this airspace. These contrails have a small influence on the climate system, it is thought. But more importantly, what you're not aware of, but there's the fact that airplane passed through that airspace took energy for it to do that, and that energy came from fossil fuel. And so that aircraft was mixing greenhouse gases, CO2 and so on, into the atmosphere as it was flying along, adding to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So there's a human influence on the climate system. Here you see a profile of a volcano. That's Mount Rainier. It's an active volcano. It will erupt at some point in the future, and when it does, there's a probability that it will erupt in an explosive fashion, launching particulates into the stratosphere. And if it succeeds in doing that, then that particular volcano will also have an influence on the climate system, and it will cool the climate system for a short period of time. What you can't see is that there's lots of snow and ice on top of Mount Rainier, and so there's hidden in this photo is the Cryosphere, which is also part of the climate system. And in the foreground, you see a little Gary Oak. I'm not sure whether or not that Gary Oak is still there. It's been a few years since I took this photo, but contained within the trunk of that Gary Oak is carbon that came from the atmosphere. That's where the carbon came from that formed the wood. When that tree dies, the wood will decompose. The carbon will eventually find its way back into the atmosphere, the carbon cycle, also influencing the climate system. So all of the components that we think of are present here, and all of the components that we attempt to represent in our models are present. Okay, so that's my very short introduction to the climate system. You can produce the same kind of introduction yourself by riffling through your photo album and finding a similar photo. So how has species climate change. That'll be my first topic, and I'll try to put that into a global context. I'll talk briefly about what changes are projected for the future, and I'll talk very briefly at the end about why greenhouse gas mitigation is not enough to deal with the problem. So we're going to have to adapt as well. And this is all by way of introduction, setting the context for a more important discussion, I think, about food security. So this is first statement that I would make about the climate system is that the system has warmed. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has used very strong words to indicate the certainty of that fact. And it said in 2007 that warming of the climate system is unequivocal. And the evidence comes from lots of different places. Warmer surface temperatures that we've noticed over the past century. The fact that the ocean has warmed, not just the surface of the ocean, but the interior of the ocean as well. So ocean heat content has increased over time. We see bits of the cryosphere that are melting away, particularly from Greenland and Antarctica, where we're losing mass to the oceans. But also snow cover extent on land is reducing over time. And as a consequence of the warming, the ocean is a big pot of water, and as you warm that big pot of water, that water needs to expand, and that causes the level to rise. And at the same time, water that's stored on the land in the form of frozen material, ice and snow that's melting, is also entering the ocean, causing its level to rise. And we've noticed over the past century a substantial amount of sea level rise. Okay, so the system is warming. Warming is evident in most places over the 20th century and into the 21st century. I'll show you how what we've noticed in British Columbia in a few minutes. But first, have a look at this. This is the as it stood about a year ago, our estimate of change in global mean temperatures over a 150-year period when we've had observations from thermometers. And so initially, we don't have a huge number of observations, but they're spread across the globe, various places, sufficient to estimate the global mean temperature anomaly relative to some period. And the uncertainty is, because the number of thermometers is relatively small, is relatively large. As time goes along, that uncertainty reduces. What you see here are multiple traces, global mean temperature anomalies compiled by different groups. They process, of course, they use the same fundamental observations, the same thermometers and so on, but they make different decisions as to how they process them to improve quality, how to include or not include observations that are felt to be suspect and so on. And so you see that there's some differences between these records, but not very large, and they all lie within that uncertainty band. And what the record shows you is that over the first part of the 20th century, there was some substantial amount of warming. Then a period during the middle part of the century when there was relatively little warming. When I was a young guy, people were talking about the potential for a new ice age approaching and possible cooling, but of course that didn't happen. And we're now into this period from the 1970s onwards when the system has been warming. And we're in a period at the moment where the system appears again to be at a roughly steady temperature. It has been for about a decade or so with lots of interannual variability. So these plateaus are evidence of low frequency variability in the climate system, but what's driving this underneath is the fact that we're changing the way energy is flowing into and out of the system by the fact that we're increasing greenhouse gas concentrations over time. So this is what the record looks like in British Columbia, and what you're looking at here are provincial mean temperature anomalies. So we've attempted to estimate what the average temperature in a particular year in British Columbia was relative to what these days we would call normal. And what we call normal at present is the average temperature between 1971 and year 2000. So this definition of normal marches along every decade. It changes. So you see that early on temperatures were lower than present. Recently they tend to be warmer than normal, where normal is this 1971 to year 2000 period. You see that there's lots of uncertainty initially. because the number of stations reporting is relatively small. That's what that thick gray curve is. The scale is on the right-hand side. So we have very small numbers of stations initially. Beginning in about the 1950s, we have 50 or more stations that are reporting from the Environment Canada network. And that peaks sometime around the 1980s or so, and then the numbers begin to decline again. So think about the effects of budget cuts on the observing system. Turns out that to estimate annual or decadal mean temperature anomalies for a relatively large region, you don't need that many thermometers. And so even recently, we would feel that these estimates of what the temperature anomaly is for any particular year to be fairly reliable. Passed through this solid black, this black dashed line is an attempt to find a smoothly varying trend that passes through the observations. And what you see here is something similar to what you see in the global record. So the global record is made up of averages over regions like BC, and on the global scale, BC is still a small place. So if you average together many of these things, what you see in the global record is warming during the first part of the century, not much happens during the middle part of the century, warming again towards the end of the century, and that's exactly what you see in the BC record as well. This is the trend over 111 years in British Columbia. It's so warming over that period at the rate of a bit more than a tenth of a degree per decade with fairly large uncertainty. So more than a degree of warming over 110 years. A little bit faster rate of warming over the latter half of the record from 1950 onwards. This ratio between these two trends for British Columbia is about exactly the same as the ratio between those two trends would be if you calculated it globally. So slower trend over a long period of time in the global mean, faster trend over a shorter period of time in the global mean. So that gives you some idea of what has happened on average within the province. This gives you some idea of what these trends are when they're spatially distributed and considered by seasons. So this shows you on the left-hand side what happened to summer maximum temperature between the beginning of the 20th century and 2004. And you see that there's been a little bit of mild cooling over much of the province during that period of time. So not much warming in terms of the warmest temperature of the year in summertime over that period of time. If you look at winter temperatures, the winter minimum temperature, what happened to the coldest temperature in a winter and what kind of trend was present in that, you see that there's been lots of warming, very substantial amounts of warming. These dark reds indicate, you can't read the scale, but it's 2.5 or 3 degrees over substantial patches of the province, warming in the coldest temperature of the year in wintertime. This has been linked to the mountain pine bark beetle infestation that we're suffering from. That's an organism whose population is controlled by the occurrence of extreme cold temperatures in wintertime. And if those extreme cold temperatures in wintertime aren't quite as severe as they were in the past, that means it has more opportunity to survive from one year to the next. And so that's one of the things that has been, according to entomologists, has been driving the mountain pine bark beetle infestation that we've been that our forest industry and our forests have been suffering from. And this is what happens to the annual mean temperature, the average temperature in a year. So more moderate warming, but these numbers, this boundary between the yellow and the orange indicates about 1 degree. That's pretty consistent with the number that we calculated ourselves. So this is what's been happening to precipitation, and all of these greenish colors indicate moistening. So we have moistening in summertime, we have moistening in wintertime, particularly the upper, more northerly parts of the province, and moistening on average occurring over the century in the annual mean. So this is becoming, over time, has become a little bit wetter place than in the past. This isn't an inconsequential amount. These green colors kind of in the middle of the scale indicate 20 or 30% increase in precipitation. So of course, climatologists, the question that has been asked for at least 30 years now, but much longer, is actually what are the potential impacts of, it's been recognized for a long time that we're increasing the concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So theoreticians were thinking about what the potential impacts of that would have been in the 19th century and even in the 18th century. More recently, we've been posing the question, can we find the impacts of increases in greenhouse gas concentrations in observations? And the answer, in temperature observations and in precipitation observations. On a global scale, the answer is yes. These diagrams try to show you how greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere have changed and how that has happened on a 10,000-year time scale. We're actually able to reconstruct atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases back at least 800,000 years on the basis of ice cores. So ice cores in Antarctica and in Greenland are excellent storehouses of past samples of what was in the atmosphere. So when that ice is formed, little bits of air are trapped in the ice. It's isolated from the atmosphere. Somebody much later comes along, takes a sample of that ice, and then analyzes what gas is present in it as a function of time. We're able to resolve in time the deposition of snow, and so we're able to understand what the greenhouse gas concentrations were as time went along. So here you see what has happened to carbon dioxide over time. Pre-industrial was about 280 parts per million. We're presently at 388 parts per million, or a little bit higher, about 390 parts per million. And on this 10,000-year time scale, that looks like an instantaneous change. It's a huge change. So something caused that, and that's our use of fossil fuels. Same story here. This is for methane. It's a very potent greenhouse gas, but not nearly as long-lived as CO2. And here for nitrous oxide, also a very potent greenhouse gas. And when you look at all three of these, you can look at others, you can see that a very large and rapid change has been made to the composition of the atmosphere. And so we use our climate models to understand what that might have done to the climate system. And so we build these climate system models. They're free-running models of the atmosphere, ocean, land surface, all of those pieces that I talked about at the beginning that are coupled together. And what we tell those models is how much greenhouse gas was present in the atmosphere at any particular time. And then we ask, given only that information, is it possible to reconstruct the history of observed change in the climate system? And it turns out that the answer is yes. If you describe to these models how greenhouse gas concentrations have changed, volcanic activity that took place, aerosols that were present in the atmosphere, they have an offsetting effect to greenhouse gases, and changes in solar output, then the colored traces are what models do. The black trace is what we observed between 1900 and about 2005. And you see that when you average across multiple models of the climate system, we're able to reproduce that observed evolution of surface temperatures pretty well. And if you leave out the human components of the forcing and ask him, well, can you explain what's happened particularly over the last 30 or 40 years on the basis of solar and volcanic activity, the answer is clearly no, you can't do it. That's what the models do if you leave out greenhouse gases and the sulfate aerosols. So that's one argument that supports the notion that humans have influenced the climate system, but that's an argument on a global scale. You can repeat this kind of argument by looking at temperatures on continental scales, and you see similar kind of story. If you look at North America, this is the decade-by-decade change in North American mean temperatures. This pink band represents the ability of climate models to simulate that when you take human forcing into account. The blue band represents the ability of climate models to simulate change when you take only solar and volcanic forcing into account. And you see that that doesn't do it for North America. Okay. And it doesn't do it for any continent, in fact. And then you can ask the question on a regional scale. Okay. And here a region is a part of a continent. So the region that we're interested in is Western North America, or perhaps if you have high latitude routes, Alaska. But again, what you see is that There's lots of variability, especially at high latitude. There's less variability at low latitude in the tropics. There's a lot of variability at high latitude. But even at high latitudes, the explanation that the thing that provides you with a better explanation for the observed history of changes in surface temperature is combination of greenhouse gases, aerosols, and natural forcing. And if you try to rely on natural forcing only, then you don't get as good an explanation of what has happened. Of course, our ability to do this kind of detection and attribution diminishes as you get to smaller and smaller areas. So what you can see in your backyard is the effect of a lot of natural variability and this gradual signal that's in the background. But because there's so much natural variability in your backyard, it's really hard to see in your backyard. And so you have to expand the backyard so you can filter out these effects. This natural cooling that occurs in one place, warming that occurs in another place, simply due to year-to-year variations in circulation. When you average that out over a large area, then the signal becomes apparent, and it's very apparent that the human signal is present. So I promised to say a little bit about projections for the future, and I'm going to go very quickly because I don't want to eat into Alex's time. In order to make a projection for the future, you need to understand what the greenhouse gas composition of the atmosphere will be in the future. And so that means you need a recipe for how much carbon dioxide will be in the atmosphere in 2020 and 2030 and so on. And you can imagine that various economic scenarios that allow socioeconomic development along different pathways that produce different amounts of emissions of different types and therefore different climate responses. And so what the IPCC has tried to do and what it's continuing to try to do is to describe some of these scenarios and then to see what the climate response would be that corresponds to those scenarios. And here you see three of them. This one leads to CO2 concentration of about 550 parts per million in year 2100, which is kind of 2 times pre-industrial. We're not going to get there, I don't think. This one, called the A1B, leads to a world where greenhouse gas concentrations in 2050 are 750 parts per million or thereabouts, close to 3 times pre-industrial. We have a chance of staying below that level. This is kind of the track that we seem to be on at the moment, which is more or less continuous increases in greenhouse gas emissions over time throughout the 21st century. And you see that leads to the largest warming, somewhere close to about 4 degrees, and that these others lead to smaller warming. And then there's one thought experiment here. The question that was asked was, well, what would happen if you could keep greenhouse gas concentrations at today's level through some miracle? And the answer is, well, the system is in this equilibrium, and so it's going to keep warming until it comes back into equilibrium. And that means that over the 21st century, even if you started at year 2000, there'd be an additional about 0.6 degrees warming, even if you managed to cap greenhouse gas concentrations, which means setting emissions to very close to zero at year 2000 levels. So if I don't have any further time than this, this is something that is going to affect us here. It will affect the growing conditions, the conditions under which we produce food. It will affect the conditions under which others produce food. And Alex will talk, I'm sure, about the relationships between our ability to produce food, demand from elsewhere to produce food, how that's affected by changes in temperature, changes in precipitation that will accompany this. We anticipate that there will be changes in water resources in British Columbia and changes in our ability to manage those water resources. And that has to do with a warming climate. At the moment, we have water resources that we can manage naturally because much water is stored on the landscape over winter. It melts in the summertime, we store it in dams, we use it to generate electricity. In a warmer world, less of that snow will arrive less of that precipitation will arrive on the landscape in the form of snow. So it'll run away when it lands on the landscape. It means we need different strategies for storing that water. Flow in the summertime in our rivers and streams will be reduced because a lot of the water that had landed on the landscape that previously would have been stored until spring runoff and summer decay is now no longer available for us. So there are many implications. There are implications for extremes as well. So we study extremes at PKIC. We study extremes in the climate community. Those extremes have impacts on the infrastructure that surrounds us, municipal stormwater handling infrastructure, our buildings and so on. It also has impacts on the production of food. What you're seeing here is a climate model's rendition of extreme 24-hour precipitation events in the 1990s. A 100-year event is about 75 millimeters or so. That becomes a little bit larger in the middle of the 21st century under one of these heavy emissions scenarios. It becomes substantially larger than that by the time you reach the end of the 21st century. These increments are 5 or 10 millimeters, the size of a 24-hour event. That's not a huge amount, you might say, but if you read the diagram like this, then you understand that it is a huge amount. So the 100-year event becomes a 70 or 75-year event, becomes a 45-year event as time goes along. Okay. That has all kinds of implications for food production, for municipal infrastructure, for water management, and so on. So that's one implication. This is one that I talked about. So this is a study that we conducted at PKIC, and it shows projected changes in stream flow in two river systems in British Columbia, the Campbell River system on Vancouver Island, and the Peace River system that flow at the Bennett Dam. In fact, the black curve shows a representation of what the current stream flow regime in those systems is. So on the Campbell River, you have kind of a mixed system. It's partially affected by snow storage, so you see a peak in runoff down the system in springtime when that snow begins to melt. That's much more strongly evident in the Peace. What you see in the future, that's the blue bands, is that in the case of the Campbell, that peak disappears entirely. Summer flow becomes substantially reduced. In the case of the Peace River system, there's still a robust amount of snow storage, but the timing of peak flow is changed. There's more flow in the wintertime, indicating that more precipitation is received as rainfall as opposed to snowfall, and summer flow is also somewhat reduced. Okay, so this has really serious implications for how we do business in this province. And so I think with that, I'll stop. I'd like to leave lots of time for Alex, and you'll have an opportunity to answer questions, ask questions, and I'll attempt, and Alex will attempt to answer them in our perhaps not particularly inept or apt way, but we'll attempt to do our best. So thank you very much.
Okay. Good evening. I push this and my thing, it should appear?
Yes.
And I push which one?
Bingo.
Right. Good evening, everybody. I'm very glad to be here. I'm really excited to be here. One of the reasons why I'm excited to be here is I love speaking to mixed groups. By mixed, I don't mean men and women. I mean students, general people from the public, academics. It's just great. The other reason I'm really happy to be here is that the work I'm going to present is new work. This is the first time I presented it, and it's part of a book that I've written that's currently under review. And so I'm really intrigued by the kinds of responses this work gets. Francis spoke a lot about climate change. I'm going to talk about food security and sort of bring it back to climate change just at the tail end. And I'm going to go fairly fast because I want to be able to have a lot of time for public interaction, because that's what this is about. So again, what I want to do is I want to discuss the impact of climate change on food security in BC. The thing is this, you need basic information on food self-sufficiency in BC. We in the province of British Columbia do not have basic information at a regional level on food self-sufficiency. You need that baseline in order to begin to model what's going to happen in the future as carbon dioxide concentrations go up, as temperature goes up, and as precipitation goes up, right? I mean, that's just common sense. And this information is really hard to get, right? So I've spent the last 5 years trying to get hold of this information. The other thing you need to understand is the vulnerability of populations to ill health. That's the food security dimension of it. In other words, you've got to understand food self-sufficiency at a regional level, and you have to understand how vulnerable to ill health and to climatic impacts, if you like, various populations are. With both of these pieces of regional information in place, we can identify regions in BC most at risk for poor food security. Regions at risk for poor food security will also likely be at a high risk for adverse impacts due to climate change. In other words, if food systems are not resilient, if they get bashed hard by climatic change or some kind of climatic adverse event, these systems are going to become into disequilibrium quickly. Disruptions of food supply, imported or limited local food production will have adverse impacts on the population in these regions. So the name of the game here is to identify vulnerable regions in terms of ill health, dietary ill health, and low food self-sufficiency in BC. Of course, the extent of risk to these regions from adverse impacts of climate change will depend whether they're more or less likely to be affected in the future by climate change. And what Francis said is pretty clear. We're going to have less snow in the winter and more runoff, which means potential for flooding in certain areas. And in the summer, if you look back at his graphs, we're going to have less stream flow. So we're going to have this odd situation of a combination of winter flooding potential in many parts of BC in combination in other parts with drought. You have to think about that in relation to food, growing food. So I want to basically try and help us understand regional food self-sufficiency in BC, identify a region with poor self-sufficiency. I also want to identify the regions of BC with high food production. So it's one thing to identify places with low food production that might be vulnerable to the impact of climate change, but it's also important to think about where we produce our food in BC and how those places might be impacted by climate change as well. So there's a dual kind of approach here. But an important digression here. Our previous report on climate change, available at www.pics.ca, dealt with the adverse impact of climate change on food production in California, because I was concerned about the fact that we import most of our fruit and vegetables from California, which is really currently in a state of drought. And this report showed that the impact of drought in California means that we're going to have much less access to external sources of food as climate change evolves. So it's really important to think about, when you're listening to this presentation, that as we move forward, our main source of food, particularly fruit and vegetable, we're not going to have as much access to that as climate change evolves, so that we have to increase food production in British Columbia. Very important, particularly in relation to fruit and vegetables, those items that are most or least present in our diets and what nutritionists are telling us we need more of. So let's just talk a little bit about food self-sufficiency at a regional level. You need basic data on the extent to which food production in a region currently meets food consumption needs of a population. So we constructed an index of the capacity of a region to meet the consumption needs of its population, an index of the regional capacity for food self-sufficiency. Production of a region, how much food it produces, divided by the amount of consumption, the consumption demand of that population in a region. The regions we're using, by the way, are the 90 or so local health areas in British Columbia. Quite small regions. Basic data on regional food consumption is available from a dietary survey which we've updated. And basically what we're able to do is measure the consumption, per capita consumption per year, of different age groups and for men and women. So if you know the consumption pattern of an individual and you aggregate the individuals in a region, you can tell what the regional consumption demand is for vegetables, fruit, dairy, eggs, and what the hell else? Oh, grain for human consumption and meat, which is 90% of the things that we eat. We're not doing fish, and I'll get into that in a minute. So that's how you get that. For plants and animals, it's a bit difficult. We're basically able to get the number of animals raised by a region, and we're able to figure out, after you process the animals, cut them up, slaughter them, etc., how much animal food, that is milk, eggs, and meat, is produced in each of 89 regions in BC. For plants, it's a bit trickier. We're able from StatsCan to get the number of hectares planted, the carrots, broccoli, blah, 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 potatoes, et cetera, add it all up, and multiply it by yields to get the yield of plant food. So we're able to get final weights of plant and animal food in each region and match that with consumption demand. Some limitations to this. It's a pretty crude tool. We don't see a lot of small outfits that Statistics Canada doesn't call farms. We don't measure fish production. The reason why is that for most Canadians, it accounts for less than 5% of the diet. And this data is from 2006. We're going to update this for 2011 when we get the census data in 2011. So here's the data. For vegetables, fruit, grain for human consumption, meat, poultry, dairy, eggs, and total food, the first column gives you the amount of production in tons. This is after waste is removed. This is on the consumer's plate. Basically, the story is that in BC, in 2006, population demand of 4.5 million people is of about 2 million tons of food. We grow in BC about 1 million tons of food. So we're about 52.2% self-sufficient. But you'll notice that this varies by type of food. So we're about 45% self-sufficient for fruit and vegetable, about 11% self-sufficient for grain for human consumption, fairly good for meat and dairy and eggs. You can then break it down to the different regions, and here's where Vancouver Island comes in. And this is a terrible map, sorry about this, but the northern area with 500,000 people is that massive great area there. Fraser's that little light blue area. The interior is that larger area to the bottom to the right. Vancouver Island and Vancouver Coastal, which is basically Vancouver in this odd area north of that. So here's what it looks like when you break it down regionally. And this is kind of important. So, and what I've done is an average plant self-sufficiency for the Fraser region, which is the lower Fraser Valley, okay? And what this says is that average plant self-sufficiency is about 65%. So the Fraser Valley produces about 65% of the fruits and vegetables needed for that population for a given year. Average animal self-sufficiency, 175%. Vancouver Island, notice this, average plant self-sufficiency about 11%. Vancouver Island, we can feed about 70,000 people a year with fruits and vegetables. On Vancouver Island, you'll notice that the average animal self-sufficiency is, 10.6, it's actually, I got that wrong, it's 13.4% for plant, and for animal, it's about 37%. And you can break this down to local health areas. There's 14 local health areas on Vancouver Island. You'll see number 85 is Vancouver Island North, 84 is Vancouver Island West. And you'll look, I bolded the numbers where there's some surplus in each region. So what this means is, if you take a look at Cowichan, you'll see that self-sufficiency in milk is 179%, which means that milk production in the Cowichan local health area is 79% in excess of the population needs in that area. So in other words, there's excess that can be shipped down to Nanaimo or to Victoria or somewhere else. Ladysmith, the same thing. Excess milk is produced. Courtenay, the same thing. Lake Cowichan, excess eggs. Saanich, excess eggs as well. Everywhere else is pretty low. You'll notice Campbell River, 5% vegetables, 5% fruit, 5% meat, 7% eggs, quite low. Lake Cowichan, you'll notice, very, very low food production. And these regions here, 84 and 85 have absolutely, except for fish production, have very little farming going on there. So this gives you an idea at a regional level around food production. And what it says in relation to climate change is the places that matter in terms of production on Vancouver Island are the Cowichan-Courtenay region. That's the breadbasket of Vancouver Island. And so what happens there around water management, around climate change is real key in terms of dealing with changes to food as that evolves. I'm going to go back to BC, the whole province for a sec here. And what we did also is we looked at what I call balanced food production. We tried to identify regions that produce a balance of plant and animal food. And you'll see here, the striped regions here, you'll notice with the stripes, and the pale blue are regions with zero or low unbalanced plant and animal food self-sufficiency. And what you notice here is that most of the west coast of British Columbia and a lot along the eastern border of BC, except for, and much of Vancouver Island, has got zero or low unbalanced food self-sufficiency. I'm going to skip this part here around dietary health, but just quickly to let you know, what I've done here is essentially looked at regions both with poor food self-sufficiency and poor dietary health. And this is what it shows. These dark spotted regions here, again, all along the west coast, are the regions with both poor dietary health and low food self-sufficiency. And these are the most vulnerable regions, with the populations most vulnerable. And certainly if climate change hits these regions in certain ways, the food production is more likely to be knocked out in these areas. In our 2009 report, we showed that regions with the worst health status, the poorest populations, the worst infrastructure to respond to disaster, and that were most likely to be exposed to future impact of climate change were the most vulnerable to adverse health impacts from climate change. Anyone remember the 2010 floods in Bella Coola? That was an instance where precipitation came not in the form of snow, but in the form of rain in copious amounts in October, and essentially flooded the valley out entirely, and with catastrophic impacts on food production. Now I want to look quickly at the main food-producing regions of BC. We've talked about places where food is not produced. Now I want to talk about places where food is produced. This is a map of meat self-sufficiency. The darker splotches are areas of high meat self-sufficiency. And what you notice here is, by the way, BC is a meat-producing place. We produce a ton of meat. And you can look and see that all through the central core of the population, meat self-sufficiency is pretty high. Meat production is fairly well dispersed throughout the province. But look at this. This is dairy self-sufficiency. I'll just switch back to the other map. That's meat, widely dispersed all over the place, dairy. Notice, this is a defining thing about climate change in relation to production. Notice how it's concentrated. So those dark regions, Vancouver Island, there's two places representing about 50% self-sufficiency, Couch and Courtney area and down towards Victoria, and in the Fraser Valley and Armstrong in the interior and up north in the Smithers area. But very, very concentrated. So that what that means is our milk production, milk's a very important product, dairy, very concentrated. So if these regions get affected by climate change, it really matters in terms of our ability to produce. Vegetable self-sufficiency, the same thing, highly concentrated. Again, in the southern portion of the province, in the southern part of the interior, northern part of the interior, and in the Fraser Valley. Same thing with fruit, with a particularly big concentration in the Okanagan Valley. So on the one hand, we've got vulnerability dispersed along the west coast of BC and Vancouver Island. On the other hand, our sites of production are very concentrated. Conclusions. The most at-risk regions for both poor food security and adverse impacts of climate change are located in most of Vancouver Island and most of BC's west coast. You need to prioritize climate change and food security adaptation planning to these regions in the province. You need to build food infrastructure to support local agriculture in these regions, to build resilience to food insecurity, mediated impacts of climate change. You need to figure out ways to increase the island's food production using low greenhouse gas emission methods of agriculture. You need to figure out how to shift croplands on the island currently devoted to non-food crops back to food crops. By the way, in our research we found Vancouver Island has the largest amount of cropland devoted to non-food crops because we're growing flowers here. Big time. need to better understand the impacts of drought on dairy production in Courtenay and Cowichan regions, as milk and dairy production is the strength of Vancouver Island's food system, and need to be able to plan for that. Need to plan for climate change impacts on fruit production in the interior, how to deal with the reduced flows for irrigation in the summer. Need a water plan, very important. As Francis said, this business of planning around water use, storage, irrigation, hugely important. Need flood and other plans for Fraser River, especially Langley, Delta, and Abbotsford. By the way, Langley, Delta, and Abbotsford are responsible for 40% of the food production of the province. Need to develop plans to reduce GHG emissions from meat and animal products sector. Thank you very much.
I'm going to bring the lights up. Thank you, Francis and Aleck. That was a great introduction, I think. And we're right on time to have a good half hour of questions. And so I'll serve as your MC and try to just direct your questions to whomever you would like.
Don't be shy.
And yes, go ahead.
The meat self-sufficiency is really high. I'm just wondering if that took into account the plant production necessary to feed the animals.
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, this is 2006 data, okay? The question was, the meat self-sufficiency map looked really high meat consumption. Did that take into account the grain grown, the animal feed to feed the animals? Is that what your question was? The answer is yes, because you see, what's happened in British Columbia is that 30 years ago we grew much less animals and we grew much less grain for animals. Now we grow way more grain for animals. So I didn't count the amount of grain for animals, because if I did that and also counted the land devoted to the animals, that would double count, right? So what I did was I separated out the kind of grain that's grown for humans only and didn't measure the grain grown for animals, but just measured the animals, because the animals eat the grain and, the house that Jack built, right? So that's kind of the way that works. Does that help? This is also from 2006. The other thing is that when you think about 2006, it was a year after an avian flu epidemic, so poultry numbers were not as high as they should have been. It was also 2 years after the Americans closed the border to Canadian beef because of the BSC epidemic, mad cow disease. So these numbers, the meat self-sufficiency numbers, may not be quite the same. As well, hogs, labeling laws for hogs change the hog market. These things fluctuate a lot as the markets fluctuate.
I am just going to ask, we've got microphones at both sides, and I think to make this more efficient, if you don't mind, and you get a little exercise out of it, congratulations. If people would just make your way to microphones on both sides. Thank you.
I'm interested in the assumptions that are made at the beginning of your projections. For example, with respect to your climate projections, are you assuming all else remains equal? For example, we potentially might run into 3 years of adverse climate conditions with a consequently crop failure, and instead of 1 billion people on the globe going to bed hungry tonight, there'll be about 3 billion, and the effect on all the equations and the infrastructure and our assumptions with respect to how we're going to eat and what sort of diet we're going to eat. So if somebody would care to address assumptions.
Do you want me to do it? Well, I can certainly start. I mean, my assumptions, you're talking here to a climate modeler, and his assumptions are going to be different than mine. My assumptions are around methods on how you actually measure production and consumption and combine that together. What I haven't done here is, I haven't sort of hung around enough with Francis to take these production figures and model what might happen as climate moves along. I mean, what we just said is adverse impacts are likely to happen with these changed stream flows in the summer and the winter and changed temperature. What we haven't done is given precise impacts of what these might look like on food. That's the next step. That research hasn't been done yet.
Francis, do you have anything to add to that in terms of your assumptions?
Yes. So I'm just trying to bring a slide back up on the screen. So the way climate modelers do their work in terms of trying to understand what the future climate might be like. So of course that does depend on assumptions, and those assumptions are described in terms of scenarios of future societal development. And so depending upon how a society develops, you could imagine a society, global society, where there's a lot of integration, global integration, where individual regions don't concern themselves about being self-sufficient. They concern themselves with producing whatever is required in the most efficient way for the largest number of people possible. And it's a world where there is a great deal of integration and cooperation, and that kind of a world leads to a world with lower greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's the kind of assumption that's represented by the warming that you see in the lower curve. Or you could imagine a society that develops where individual regions are fiercely competitive with each other, and they try to have self-sufficiency within each region. Well, that means using whatever energy resources are available within that region, and those may be heavily polluting energy resources. And so that's the kind of society that corresponds to this scenario where there's rapid warming. So yes, in making our climate change projections, there are indeed very extensive assumptions that are made. And we try to make the use of those assumptions clear by always conditioning our projection of warming as under such and, we have statements that go, well, under such and so an emission scenario that corresponds to a particular type of economic development, we anticipate that there will be this type of climate change as a result. So we're indicating to policymakers that there's a choice to be made, and that's the debate about mitigation. But the point that I didn't make very clearly during the lecture is that there's also a lot of adaptation that has to be undertaken, because regardless of which of these paths we choose to travel along, there's going to be warming and changes in precipitation distribution, changes in the potential ability to undertake agriculture in particular places and so on. And so that's stuff that we'll have to adapt to.
Thanks very much. Could I suggest that the assumptions and the cross-talk between various disciplines would be a very interesting subject for next year's effort?
Thank you.
Yeah, my question was actually for you. It was to do with, you have areas that have very low self-sufficiency and then areas that have a surplus, but it's always seems like a surplus in one area and then again they're very low in others. Is the focus solely on providing a surplus in the areas that have no self-sufficiency, or is it also looking to try and expand self-sufficiency in those areas to maybe bring down a huge surplus like the 300% levels and make it closer to 100% in more production areas? I didn't know.
It's a good question. These maps are presented to show a kind of to give an idea of the world of self-sufficiency of food in British Columbia. They're not meant to show, okay, there's a 300% surplus here. Why don't you get together with people who need food in the next jurisdiction where there's a deficit? Because the reason is this, is that the flow of food, what I've shown is the theoretical capacity of land in different regions to produce food in relation to the consumption demand. But the flow of food from a region like Cowichan, for example, to a region with low food production like Lake Cowichan, may be completely different because it's going to be determined by the corporate behavior of the super value located somewhere in Lake Cowichan. And that super value may be sourcing food from Washington State rather than locally from Cowichan or Courtenay. And that's another area. I think what I'm trying to tell you is that food security research is very underdeveloped. So just getting to this stage here where we're showing the capacity of land to produce in relation to consumption, self-sufficiency, is just a small plank in the foundation that's needed. The next foundation is to get at what you're getting at, and that's to figure out how's food moving? What are the flows? How do the food supply chains move? And to do that, you've got to get into the corporations because corporations are essentially de facto determining how food flows. But we don't have, that's outside the purview of public policy to large measure, and we don't have a good handle on this. And I keep advocating to people, it's necessary to do this kind of research at the corporate level to understand what's happening, to get at your very good question.
This question is also for Aleck. Kind of leads off of the what you were just talking about. But on your map, you showed areas of low self-sufficiency for the coast specifically. And I wonder if maybe an additional part of your study might be looking at resilience of different communities, because my understanding is a community like Haida Gwaii, like maybe they have a very low self-sufficiency for food, but they're very resourceful and resilient because they're in a harsh climate and are used to being cut off from supplies. So maybe that's another possible layer. Like, would you consider that as also part of the area that you study?
Well, I think Francis can probably back me on this, but my understanding is that communities that are more likely to succeed in adaptation as climate change evolves are those that are more resilient. So resilience is huge. But the question is, what do you mean by resilience? So many people, there's lots of academic confusion about this. What is resilience? Is it to do with community cohesion? And what is resilience? Here's an interesting academic question. What is resilience in relation to a food system? For example, on Haida Gwaii, which we have been studying, they passed meat regulations there in 2004, which essentially disenfranchised many of the meat farmers in the area, so that the resilience of that local food economy has been somewhat compromised, although I would argue that, that community may be quite socially cohesive and quite strong in its way. But this issue of resilience, I think is key in relation to climate change. If communities are more resilient, they're more likely to be able to develop policies and to be able to move ahead in the face of climate change in productive ways.
Sorry, but just to add, but it just seems to me that someone living in the middle of a cattle farm would be maybe less resilient than someone living right on the coast if, say, all their cattle suddenly died. What could they eat? But if you live on the coast, maybe you could eat something out of the ocean. I would think that there maybe be more available to them, but I'm just theorizing, so thanks for your talk.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My question is, first I would like to thank the two speakers because their talk was very, very illustrative. The problem, though, is how can we think of adapting to climate change in the food production with the type of society we are in, which is essentially market-driven and growth-oriented, and where the communities are expecting the governments to do the job for them. It's an area of different research, I understand, but that's a big problem.
So I'm far from a policy expert, so I'm not going to respond in that particular way. I think we have, although the amount of climate change that has occurred up to this point is arguably not large, we have at least some examples of adaptations that have been undertaken. I'm sorry about that. So we certainly have some examples of adaptations that have already been undertaken. I think there are a point that I've been itching to make in response to some of Alex's maps. So Alex showed an example of an agricultural industry that was very localized in space, and that's the dairy industry. So in British Columbia, dairy products are produced in only a few places. And so in order to be able to think about how that industry is going to have to adapt, I think a first step would be to understand, well, why is that industry concentrated in the places that it is? And presumably it's concentrated in the places that it is because it's close to markets and because it has the necessary resources in those locations to undertake that industry. And those resources, principal resources, is climate and soil. So I would think you would need a particular kind of climate and particular kind of soil conditions in order to be able to grow the crops that dairy cattle requires so that you can profitably produce dairy products. And so this industry is an industry that is in a sense captive in a particular location because of the resources that it requires. So the adaptation problem for that industry would be very much like the adaptation problem that parks managers have to face as well. So park manager has responsibility for ensuring the sustainability of the species that live in that park. If the park is fixed in space, but the climate is not. And in the same way, the dairy industry is fixed in space, presumably because of the proximity to markets. But the climate is not going to change, and so the adaptation problem that requires a great deal of research is how is this industry going to move, or is there potential for this industry to move to a different location as climate changes? That's a very complex question to answer, but I think your question points to that kind of consideration in thinking about how adaptation might be undertaken and the kinds of things to worry about.
Thank you very much. I agree that you answered part of the question, and I'll be in touch with you because I've been dealing with these questions on the social change part.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? I'm a farmer on the Saanich Peninsula, and I'm always intrigued to come out to listen to conversations about food security because the reality for our family farm operation is that we're subsidizing every single pound of food that we produce on our farm at this point. I get no return for my labor. I have a huge capital investment. And actually, I work 2 other jobs in order to pay to farm to produce food. So I just question whether, this is all a little bit self-indulgent, perhaps, this conversation about food security, when in actual fact, the public isn't paying its cost of insurance for food security at the moment. The food security is being paid for by the backs of farmers who are producing the food at below their costs. So it's a bit self-indulgent, I think, to talk about food security without actually acknowledging that it's part of a whole economic structure, and that really the solution, if there is such a thing, is in looking at the way we are valuing that food and how we're leveraging our economic structure around ensuring that food is viably produced locally. So that's just a comment, perhaps, more than a question, but I would also say that on our sheep farm, we would be extremely strapped to produce the same amount of meat that we're producing without the importation of grains from the prairies. And I heard you talk about the modeling you've done, but for example, the egg production that you showed of 137% in Saanich being, because we have a large egg producer in the Saanich Peninsula. That's entirely dependent on grain coming from the prairies, and I don't know if you factored that into your equation, quite frankly. Thank you.
No, we didn't, but I think I actually hate the term food security. You'll notice my talk was mainly about something I call food self-sufficiency. The term food security is a very misleading one for several reasons. First of all, there's about 500 definitions of the damn thing, so you can make it mean whatever you want it to mean. It's a real problem. The other thing I'd like to say about your situation, food security, I think, in a place like Vancouver Island is about supporting people like you. If farmers are not supported, and in other words, if they can't sell their food at a profit, if there's not a business model that supports the different sectors locally, then you can't survive. And your comment is about, is almost a cry for help. It's like, you're working hard and you're not getting anywhere. And a lot of the discussion around food security is around, doesn't deal enough with this business of farmers needing business models that work for them. And in order to promote local food security, if that's what we're going to do here, as a way to being resilient in terms of our food system to climate change, the issue has to be to find good business models. This goes back to the market question earlier, market-based solutions that can work for farmers.
So I had another question for you. Sorry.
Me?
Yeah. So for your calculations, you're using basically the population of the island versus the food that we produce. If we can't, for argument's sake, not produce any more, at what number for what our population has to come down before Vancouver Island becomes self-sufficient? Like we're here at 700,000, just over. What would we have to come down to before Vancouver Island was self-sufficient?
Well,
just
right now,
out of curiosity.
Right now, based on my calculations, which are 5 years out of date, by the way, and not thinking about climate change, we could, with the production we produce here, produce a pretty cholesterol-rich diet for 175,000 people. In other words, for about 25% of Vancouver Island's population for 1 year. But that diet would people would end up having scurvy because there's not enough vegetables and fruit, and they would end up having very high cholesterol levels because it would mainly be, eggs, and once the eggs ran out, you start to eat the chickens and the dairy. So we can support about 20% of the population right now in Vancouver Island-based food. But this is a hypothetical scenario, right? I mean, because we're not at war with Kitsilano. Kitsilano hasn't blockaded us, and we do get food from other parts of the world here. But it's just a way of looking at what we've got and understanding. What I'm trying to point out is that Cowichan and Courtney areas, if you want to produce foods locally, those are your bread baskets, and you have to think about the kinds of things Francis was talking about. What happens when you get not snow coming down in the winter, but a hell of a lot of rain? What does that mean for flooding in these short river valleys? And what happens when those flows are reduced and you've got a drought in the summertime? And so those are the kinds of ways that climate change concentrates the mind around the specific local problems for food production in Vancouver Island.
Thanks.
John? Oh, I guess, okay. A question for each of you. First, for the climatologist, there's a big dip in the 1940s to 1950, and she takes off again when you go back to that particular graph. Does that have anything to do with the war and basically all production moved towards war production and less towards consumer goods, whatever else? And Alex, for you, what possibility is for substitution? Like you're looking at, this is dairy lands. In a lot of the grazing areas, we're producing most of our meat in the province. I don't know how suitable that is for other crops other than grazing. Like in some areas you can grow grain, but you're not going to grow much vegetable in most of the areas where the great grazing lands, where the huge ranches are. I drove through the Douglas Lake Ranch a few years ago, and there's not a whole lot of potential there to grow vegetables. There's a few flatlands which would be good, but the bulk of it is basically just grazing lands. So I'm wondering about the substitution side of it, and part of the reason I wonder that is because I read something not that long ago, or heard something, that something like 80% or the energy and the effort that goes into growing food for animals would feed about 80% of the world. If we weren't feeding the animals, if we had that land being used for growing vegetables, fruit, whatever else to feed perhaps a more healthy diet.
Want to go first, Alex?
Oh, sure. Well, a very good Swedish researcher named Carlson Kanyama has done great work looking at what would happen if, in her case, every Swede switched from a normal Swedish diet to become vegans, to become vegetarians, that kind of thing. And what they show is that the demand for animal products drops precipitously, and as you said, the energy required for production of animal protein is much higher, and also the greenhouse gas emissions consequent from animals is much higher. So certainly, and so part of as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, it's fine in theory to substitute, but what would drive a substitution like that would be a shift in the human diet, right? And then the second part of your question is, well, if the shift in the human diet, if people began to eat differently so that they demanded more vegetables and fruit and less, cheese on their pizza, the question then is the land that you described up in the Peace River going to be amenable for other things? The other way to put it is maybe that land isn't amenable for substitution, but perhaps other lands that are more productive can be even made more productive. For example, you could use energy-efficient greenhouses to grow vegetables much more productively in southwestern BC than they do in the field today. So there are other kinds of substitutions that are possible. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, the first question was whether or not there was a trace of World War II in this diagram, and the observation that the person posing the question made was that there seems to be a dip in temperature that occurs coincident with or right after World War II. Well, there's a very interesting whodunit story in this temperature record. And this little bump here that occurs between about 1940 and 1945 is associated with World War II, but not for the reason that you were supposing. So you were supposing that it might have been a change in the nature of emissions that caused this. But actually, there's very interesting work that was done at the University of Washington just a few years ago that dissected this, and we came to understand that part of this bump here has to do with the effect of World War II on the global merchant marine that was operating on the oceans. So that's the marine the shipping system that carts our freight around. 70% of the world is covered with water, and 70% of the temperature observations, therefore, that go into this come from measurements of sea surface temperature. And the way in which we get measurements of sea surface temperature, at least up until recently, was from ships of opportunity, freighters that were traveling around on the oceans. And early on in the process, most freighters, most ships collected sea surface temperature observations by tossing a bucket over the side of the boat, hauling up that bucket of water, putting a thermometer in it, measuring the temperature. Later, what increasing numbers of ships did was to measure the temperature of the water that was being taken in through the side of the hull in order to cool the engines. So there was a thermistor placed in the pipe, and automated temperatures were taken. The bucket temperatures were cooler than the engine intake water type temperatures. And the reason for that is you haul that bucket of water up on deck, the ship is steaming along at 15 knots. There's all kinds of wind blowing by the superstructure that's causing evaporative cooling of the bucket all of the time that thermometer is in the water. And so those temperatures were biased downwards. This record contains an adjustment for that effect based on the proportion of ships that were reporting bucket temperatures and the proportion of ships that were reporting engine intake cooling water. And that proportion changed abruptly during World War II because some countries took their merchant marines off the oceans while other countries left them on the oceans. And so that's part of the explanation for this little bump here. This period of cooling here, we don't have or lack of warming, we don't have a complete explanation for, but part of it is internal variability of the climate system. The climate system varies naturally on multi-decadal timescales the ocean contains a huge amount of heat, and it takes a long time to exchange that heat with the atmosphere back and forth. And so that causes slow natural variations in the climate system. But part of the story here also was a mix of fuels that was being burned in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and the growth of emissions of aerosols into the atmosphere over that time. Those aerosols tend to be reflective of sunlight, and therefore they reduce the amount of warming. They offset the effects of greenhouse gas forcing. So if you're trying to control the amount of warming, a good thing is a dirty atmosphere. And if you're trying to clean up the atmosphere for health reasons or to improve agricultural production, for example, you reduce the emissions of sulfate aerosols, as we've done in North America. Ironically, that allows greenhouse gases to do a better job of warming the planet. Okay, so there's an interesting story, and a couple of stories in this record.
So now you have something to talk about at cocktail parties. Good question. I think we have one. We have about 3 minutes, so it depends on how quickly you go. So
I'll just make it.
You were up. I think you were up first, weren't you? Yes, go ahead.
So this is another sort of war-related question, but I'm aware when you, I'll get back to in a minute, but you talked about your data and that you really had to, sort of use the data that was available to you through Statistics Canada or through these mega surveys that forced you to sort of underreport perhaps the true production that would be available, say, through the Gulf Islands with their garlic farms and the sheep production and whatnot. So I'm just wondering, first question is what you might do to try to address that so you get a better picture of what the productivity is, and presumably, again, the consumption, because I'm not sure that if I go to the Moss Street Market, you're able to gather that data or either consumption or production, and how that might change the story you're able to tell and your all of that. But the other question I have is I had recently an opportunity to be in Switzerland and went to a glass museum where they did an amazing, told an amazing story of how Switzerland responded during the war when it's almost analogous to a climate change where they didn't have any food coming in. They didn't have any ability to get food from Italy or from other, because the borders were closed, and that entire community adapted because they had some infrastructure. They had one glass factory that they mobilized to create all these jars for home canning, and there was an awful lot of then of harvesting of local resources, and somehow that country. So it seems like war is another model that we can look at to see what the adaptability and resiliency potential is of a community. And I think of Vancouver Island and all of the resources we have here that really are lying dormant, all of our rose hips and ferns and natural foods that we're starting to learn about and trying to harvest. I'm wondering how you might address all of that in the predictability, or, I mean, I'm assuming one of your goals is to try to change policy in terms of how we're approaching food and consumption in our area. So it's a whole pile of questions there, but I'm just wondering.
I'm going to answer your first question in a real precise way because I have a little bit of time, but we chat after. First thing is a really great question. It's a methodological question. Here's the answer, I think. What you do is you go to Statistics Canada, you get there, we do the calculations we've done here for the Gulf Islands, say. Then you go to every farmer on the Gulf Islands and you measure what they actually produce in the same year that you get Statistics Canada data, and you do a validation study to see to what extent Stats Canada, this method I've got, is fantasy or reality. Because the only way, and these validation studies haven't done it, as I told you, food security research is nowhere. Nobody's funding it. There's no money in it. And the NSERC won't fund it, CIHR won't fund it. So the basic work, and you've just identified a huge methodological problem, has not been done. So the answer to your question is I don't know. The work has to be done, and we're going to try and do that work.
I think we'll take one more if it's a quick question, and then
it's more of a comment and a thanks to the speakers, but just to Aleck in particular, your methodology. I know about the methodology challenges you face, and I just wanted to comment that accomplishing what you have with the data that's available is is quite something.
Yeah, it is. It's hard.
The challenge that I would like you to address next, in your next elaboration of this, is supply chain. Because your data basically questions a localization issue, and then we need to understand how the supply chains work between localities. So you've created a microcosm in BC, but really what we're doing in food supply is global,
Yep.
and particularly in relation to California. So then to start taking that model and amplifying it and developing the linkages on a supply chain and saying, okay, what's happening in California when they run out, where they're not supplying the rest of North America and increasingly Asia as they run into these kinds of climate change problems. So I just wanted to say thanks, but that's the next step.
We'll be looking for donations for that research. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd really like to thank the audience, all of you coming out tonight to this lecture. I hope you can come to other things over the course of the next week, and indeed, anytime. I think, the University of Victoria is open always with lots of interesting things going on. And please join me in thanking Aleck and Francis for their talk tonight.